Before the bombs stopped falling, before surrender documents were stamped and signed, Berlin had already become a battlefield of shadows. One little-known truth that outsiders never fully grasp: Allied intelligence was positioning stay-behind human assets inside the collapsing Reich even before the shooting ended. Not to fight, but to see, to listen, to mark. Because by late 1944, the Western Allies understood something grim. The coming struggle over the German capital wouldn't end on VE Day. It would simply switch uniforms, flags, and language. And in this atmospheric darkness, in tenements with shattered stairwells, in half-burned air raid shelters beneath the Charlottenburg facades, one codename kept appearing in small OSS teleprinter fragments: Kapellmeister, a signals officer, Berlin-born, British-educated, a man who could interpret routing logic in his head the way others read sheet music. For OSS X2 branch, he represented a category of source that analysts described in cold shorthand: placement plus access. He sat precisely at an intersection Western intelligence feared the Soviets could exploit: the nexus between Luftwaffe field cipher stations, emergency Enigma routing corrections, and the late war emergency divert message structure. He was not simply another German with a radio set. He knew where certain books were hidden, and in cryptography, that meant he knew where minds were hidden, because codebooks were biographies, maps, and confessions. Yet the attempt to embed him was a brutal exercise in timing. Allied bombing hadn't just collapsed factories, it had collapsed predictability. Transportation in Berlin by autumn 1944 was a map of interrupted arrows. Power grids flickered off without warning, telephone relays went silent, and bureaucratic offices were working from fire-damaged annexes where charcoal dust still floated in the winter air. OSS X2 officer Edward B. Parsons, in a field memo dated 19th December 1944, wrote the line: "Berlin is becoming less capital city and more geometric puzzle of rubble and smoke." Parsons noted that a human asset in that environment had to be both courier and analyst, but also, crucially, improviser. Kapellmeister seemed to excel at that last trait more than most. From Allied decrypts, we know he had unusual positioning. He assisted with emergency reassignments of cipher blocks after field posts were bombed. This put him inside the chain that decided which Enigma keying groups were sacrificed for speed and which were preserved for continuity. For an outsider with training in mathematics, he'd studied briefly in London, allegedly at King's. This gave him both maps and habits of mind, pattern recognition at scale, the exact thing a post-war intelligence service would kill to control. The struggle was simple to state, impossible to execute: plant a spy in a dying capital, guard him against detection by the Gestapo, then keep him alive long enough to survive the Soviet takeover. In practice, Berlin 1944-45 offered nothing like protection, only chaos. Foreign diplomats burned files in courtyards. Senior Nazi officials evacuated with suitcases full of personal archives. Black market coffee traded hands with Einsatzgruppe officers. There were no lanes for clean espionage, only contaminated intersections. Kapellmeister's initial contact channels were handled through a safe house in Wilmersdorf, disguised as the backroom of a piano repair shop. Its front signage survived into 1945, Klavierwerkstätte Hauser. Though, Allied intelligence never confirmed whether Mr. Hauser himself was the owner or simply a cover identity supported by forged municipal permits. British SOE post-war interrogations note that the shop's piano hammers were genuine, but the ledger books were not. Some pages were filled with nonsense musical keys, not actually coordinates. Others, encoded courier schedules, written as imaginary recital times. The reveal and the threat came from Soviet awareness. Red Army GRU officers had already prepared their own Berlin target lists by November 1944, months before they took the city. Certain NKGB Residentura reports suggest they were actively hunting German officers with knowledge of special cipher distribution. The West did not have infinite time. This was a race. It was not about winning history, but about preventing an adversary from weaponizing history first. Modern analysts might say this was a preview of the Cold War. In truth, the Cold War was already here. The uniforms simply hadn't been updated yet, and this is where the first chilling silence enters the record. The last complete OSS X2 fragment referring to. Kapellmeister in late 1944 mentions a December piano delivery, a phrase almost certainly meaning a dead drop transfer of micro-coded cipher groupings. After that, small updates continue, but never again with the same precision. It is as though the shadow of Soviet penetration began lengthening over the Berlin ruins even before Soviet artillery arrived. Next, the fog thickens, April-May 1945, the period when Allied T-Force teams moved from theory to boots in dust, the period where Kapellmeister's name should have become clearer, but instead begins to dissolve. And that is where Part 2 begins. April 1945. The Reichstag dome is already a skeleton of twisted iron. Yet while most of the world remembers Berlin's final weeks as the desperate last stand of the Wehrmacht, a lesser-known truth threads through those ruins. US Army T-Force units were not simply following behind infantry, they were racing ahead of them. Their mission was not conquest, it was capture. Capture of laboratories, capture of vaults, capture of thinking. Every minute the war clock ticked. Allied planners feared an irreversible Soviet lead in the emerging science of signals exploitation. T-Force reports from 12th Army Group appear dry on paper, short paragraphs, typed with monotonous brevity. But the subtext is clear. The most valuable prizes left in Berlin were not people, not even machines. They were patterns, cipher logs, routing tables, working notes for Enigma reconfiguration under attack. The West wanted them, the Soviets wanted them, and Kapellmeister, if alive, knew where some of these caches still sat. The struggle in these final days was not hypothetical, but brutally physical. Berlin was not open ground. It was a maze of smoke-speared streets, blocked by tramcars, downed telephone lines, Sherman and Panther carcasses, smashed-out pharmacies, and burning timber. War diaries of the 6th Armored Division describe trying to force reconnaissance jeeps into intersections where the asphalt literally bubbled under incendiary heat. Radios crackled, then faded. Runners often had greater reliability than SCR 610 sets simply because no antenna could survive flying masonry. T-Force officers operating alongside the 3rd Armored and 83rd Infantry Divisions were forced into the ugliest improvisations just to maintain a chain of custody over what they collected. Film canisters in gas mask bags, dossiers stuffed into bread sacks, scribbled coordinates jammed into musette pouches. It is here, in the tactical chaos of 6th of May 1945, where the Allied paper trail thins, yet still exists sufficiently to create suspicion. One line, typed by an enlisted clerk working under Captains David K. Spofford, reads, "Asset claims Luft LW cipher files, location probable Friedrichshain." LW meaning Luftwaffe. Cipher files meaning extremely high-value emergency keyblock logs. Spofford's log, timed at 1432, adds possible routing via Wittenbergplatz if bridges hold. That bridging condition is important because every hour the Soviets were massing west of the Spree, more crossings fell to artillery. The window was almost closed. Insight appears in a short handwritten annotation in the margin of the same Spofford sheet. Kapellmeister, underlined once. No rank, no description, just the code name. Someone within Spofford's chain believed the anonymous asset providing the location. Data wasn't a generic walk-in, but the same Berlin-born. Signals Officer X2 had cultivated months earlier. The reveal, however, is darker. There is no corresponding debrief report. Normally, any such contact with a human source would generate at least 2 follow-ups, sitrep and exhume, especially if the asset promised actionable cipher material. For every other T-Force contact that week, paperwork exists. For this one, the one potentially tied to Kapellmeister, it simply stops when theory floated in the late 1940s by an X2 case officer was that the handoff, attempted at Friedrichshain, was never completed, that the asset, attempting to reach the American sector, was intercepted by a Soviet forward reconnaissance detachment, possibly SMERSH. Support for this is circumstantial, but chilling. Soviet combat engineer diaries reference seizing radio papers from German civilians in that district between 5th and 7th of May. No names, no identifying details, just scraps of text hinting at encrypted material. Another, quieter possibility raised in a 1953 CIA memorandum is far more uncomfortable: that the Americans themselves aborted the meet when they realized the Soviets were closer to that sector than believed, and the asset simply vanished in the rubble without further attempt. In intelligence work, abandonment is not discussed publicly. Files don't say we left him, they just go blank. What remains unambiguous is that the contact event should have crystallized Kapellmeister's fate, but instead dissolves it. There is no success report, no failure report, no body, just one typed phrase in Spofford's chain that now reads like a door closing into darkness. The modern application is almost cruel in its clarity. Data can survive war, but human intermediaries, the ones who know what the data means, are the most fragile link. Break them, and the truth becomes an artifact with no interpreter. Part 2 ends where the paper trail ends, 6th May 1945, with one final radio margin notation in Allied archives. No further traffic expected. And then, silence. Part 3 begins with that silence being interpreted not as loss, but as theft. Summer 1945. Berlin is still technically the prize, but anyone who handled real intelligence in these months understood the capital had already become something else. A vacuum chamber, not of ideology but of proof. Allied liaison records for June, July, August show a constant churn of cables where British and American officers weren't trying to identify what happened to Nazi intelligence structures. They were trying to identify what happened to their own sources. Kapellmeister's codename appears in exactly 11 surviving fragments from this period. And every time it appears, its context is contradiction. SOE swear he made first contact in Schmargendorf on 23rd of June, attempting exfiltration into the British zone. OSS signals logs suggest he was already turned by a Soviet NKGB. Cut out sometime 7-8 May, both cannot simultaneously be true, unless there were two different men claiming to be the same asset. And that uncertainty is the exact environment intelligence officers fear most. The struggle for truth wasn't happening in interrogation rooms. It was happening in annex offices, where patched-up field radios sat beside half-repaired Underwood typewriters, where US Army Counter-Intelligence Corps officers compared handwritten street names to the new Soviet-controlled street index and realized half the safe houses they thought were reachable had been swallowed into the eastern sector overnight. Berlin was a newly drawn chessboard, but no one agreed which color which square belonged to. And while the world publicly celebrated victory, Western intelligence officers were already privately terrified that their newly forming post-war structure was being poisoned at the root by missing provenance. Then came the intercept. A single radiogram, origin uncertain, logged by an Allied listening post sometime after midnight 8th May. The message was short, possibly only a fragment. 3 words survive in the surviving decrypt attempt. Operation Vogelgitter active. The significance of that phrase lies in what historians still can't prove. Whether Vogelgitter was a Luftwaffe internal term for emergency cipher redistribution, or a Soviet internal codename for a targeted hunt for German comms officers with access to fallback Enigma tables. Because if it was the first Zunsides, then Kapellmeister was still trying to protect German files from destruction, hoping to barter them west. If it was the second, then Vogelgitter meant his name had already been passed to the Soviets as a target. The insight appears in a small typed addendum attached to the attempted decrypt. The analyst, initialed only PSW, wrote 4 words in the margin. Source already compromised? The question mark is important. Analysts almost never use them. They write in declaratives, probability assignments, degree of confidence language. But a question mark is personal. It is a doubt, not a metric. Modern intelligence historians often misread this period as bureaucratic sloppiness. It wasn't sloppiness. It was velocity. Files were not missing because no one cared. They were missing because multiple governments cared simultaneously, and each was trying to assemble the same jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces hidden by the other side. There was no master ledger for Europe's post-war human assets. There was only competing ownership claims. And so the reveal of this segment is quiet but cruel. 2 separate Western services believed they still had a relationship with Kapellmeister, yet neither could prove they physically saw him after 6 May. It is here where Cold War reflection becomes unavoidable. This was not yet CIA versus KGB. Technically, it was still OSS versus NKGB, but the thinking had already changed. Intelligence was no longer a parasitic wartime necessity. It had become strategic state infrastructure. The continuity problem Who do we trust to tell the story of how we won had become national security, and the disappearance of Kapellmeister sits at exactly that seam. The application to modern tradecraft is direct. Provenance is the first thing adversaries target. If you destroy the continuity of a source's chain, you don't just eliminate a witness, you eliminate the West's ability to narrate its own success. Silence becomes a weapon, which brings us to the close of Part 3, because while Allied reports go dark, Soviet reports become even darker. NKGB registries, released decades later, do not show his legal birth name, nor any commonly known cover. Only one ambiguous line, likely a case routing note, appears in a 1946 Soviet internal ledger: West-leaning Kapellmeister transferred. Transferred where? To what branch? For what purpose? No Western archive can answer, and so the silence becomes possession. Which takes us directly into Part 4. The CIA inherits a file that contains more absence than fact, and must pretend the gaps are evidence. 1946. The Office of Strategic Services is dissolved, its mission carved up into new organs: state, war, and a shell organization called the Central Intelligence Group. Within a year, this becomes the Central Intelligence Agency, and among the crates, transit boxes, and manila envelopes moved from temporary storage in Wiesbaden to the brand new intelligence registry in Washington sits a folder that nobody wants to claim ownership of. The tab reads simply, Berlin, X2, high-value source, Kapellmeister. The file is thin, but the silence inside it is heavy. The new CIA doesn't inherit a triumph, it inherits a question mark. The hook is almost brutal. The very first CIA registry officer to initial the Kapellmeister folder writes a short note that still survives in the declassification microfilm. His handwriting is elegant, British style. The sentence, primary source unknown after 6 May 45, provenance discontinuity unacceptable. That phrase, provenance discontinuity, sounds academic. In intelligence language, it is lethal. It means we don't know who this man was at the moment we supposedly claimed him, which means he could have been lying, or doubled, or misattributed, or stolen. The struggle becomes bureaucratic, not cinematic, but no less dangerous. CIA analysts inherit a Berlin zoning map that has already been redrawn by Soviet authorities. Safe houses once reachable from Wittenbergplatz are now sealed behind a sector checkpoint line that British soldiers call simply the fence. They try to reconstruct movements based on ration cards, Reich traffic forms, and seize Gestapo index cards. But here is the critical detail. Berlin in 1946 is not post-war. It is post-documentation. Paper is unstable territory. No two agencies have identical lists of addresses, and the Soviets refuse to share arrest rosters for civilians seized in Friedrichshain in May. The insight appears in a single document, still cited today by Cold War historians, a CIA directorate. Of Plan's working note from 1947, it describes the concept of unrecoverable vector, meaning a case where the path of an asset's identity forks irreconcilably in multiple directions at once. Kapellmeister is the example used. The note says, "We have no proof who captured the mind." That word is chilling. Not man, not body, but mind. In one of the few interviews later published by a British liaison officer who worked this case, name redacted, but widely believed to be from MI5 Section Phi, he recalled how London reacted when they learned that the Americans had inherited Berlin registry duty. His remark was brutally honest. "We were more afraid he had been taken alive. Because if he had been taken alive, and if he had been truly turned, then he would have been able to describe not only the way Enigma was misrouted in the final months, but the way Allied exploitation teams internally coordinated their exploit priorities. That would have revealed pattern, not of German weakness, but of Allied methodology. This is not espionage melodrama. This is the cold geometry of post-war counterintelligence. And here we arrive at the reveal. The internal debate shifts. The West stops asking, where is he? They begin asking who reached him first. The CIA tries to improve the file, not by adding evidence, but by removing uncertainty. They prune contradictions. They annotate with probability assignments. A red grease pencil mark on a 1948 addendum lists 3 statistically calculated fates. A. Soviet recruitment, unknown holding branch. 42% B. Soviet detention, no continued utility. 31% C. Uncontrolled death during flight, Berlin, 5 to 7 May, 27%. This isn't narrative, it's actuarial triage, and yet, something stranger happens. Silence continues into the 1950s. But silence does not mean nothing. Silence in intelligence archives is behavior. Because the CIA keeps the Kapellmeister file active, not to solve it, but to prevent anyone from closing it. Because if the file is closed, then the question is answered by default, and that default would be politically radioactive. The application to modern listeners is simple. Uncertainty is not absence. Uncertainty is the most useful tool an adversary can wield. If the West cannot prove the story, then the Soviet version becomes equally plausible. Which leads us to the close. By 1950, internal CIA circulation of the Kapellmeister problem quietly stops being listed under WWII residual. It is reflagged under Soviet exploitation, high value, status unresolved. Deletion would have been cleaner. But deletion would have implied certainty, so the file remains unconfirmed. And in that limbo, the ghost becomes a strategic threat. Next, Part 5. The first alleged walk-in, claiming Kapellmeister didn't vanish, but survived. 1950. The early Cold War had begun in earnest. Berlin, divided into 4 sectors, was no longer a city of rubble and makeshift safe houses. It had become a chessboard for intelligence operations. Soviet control of the eastern sector was absolute, but the western sectors teemed with new agencies, new officers, new agendas, and somewhere in this tangled web, Kapellmeister, the signals officer who had disappeared in the chaos of May 1945, allegedly reappeared, at least in rumor. The CIA's Directorate of Plans, still holding the thin folder from 1946, received a curious report. A man claiming to have smuggled Kapellmeister into the American sector in exchange for cigarettes. The notation in the CIA microfilm archive reads, "Walk-in unverified. Fingerprint matching failed. The hook is immediate. After 5 years of silence, someone is asserting direct knowledge of the missing asset. The struggle for verification is almost laughably modern in its simplicity. Fingerprint files exist but are incomplete. The man claiming knowledge is vague, citing only a temporary name and a safe house near Tiergarten. Witness reports are second-hand, and multiple agencies warn against rushing. The CIA case officer involved, later anonymized in 1952, declassified notes, emphasizes, probability exists that claimant is disinformation. Exercise extreme caution. If true, value immeasurable. If false, could be Soviet operation. This is the essence of post-war counterintelligence. Every appearance is suspect, every story is a vector, and every contact could be the final line in a disappearing narrative. The insight becomes clear when reviewing subsequent CIA memos from 1950-1952. The agency could neither confirm the walk-in story nor dismiss it entirely. One log, dated 12th of September 1950, reads almost poetically for intelligence bureaucracy. Subject claims transfer of HVAS, no corroboration possible. Unverified assertion constitutes operational ambiguity. Maintain surveillance, HVAS of course, meant high-value Allied source, the code now synonymous with Kapellmeister. The reveal deepens when modern researchers examine Soviet registry entries released decades later. Despite extensive NKGB/KGB archives, there is no listing for Kapellmeister under real or known cover names. Only one cryptic line appears in internal transfer lists, likely from the late 1940s. West-leaning Kapellmeister, transferred. Transferred where? Under whose authority? To what purpose? The absence of clarity only magnifies the mystery. If he had been smuggled into the American sector, why do no verified post-war sightings or employment records exist? Why does every trace evaporate into administrative haze? The human struggle in these years is palpable. CIA analysts and MI5 liaisons argue over plausibility, referencing a Berlin they have never seen in its entirety. A city reshaped by politics, surveillance, and division. Intelligence officers grapple not only with the question of life or death, but with control over knowledge itself. In intelligence, to know and not to act is nearly as dangerous as to act blindly. Every hypothetical scenario, escape to West Berlin, recruitment by the Soviets, voluntary disappearance, must be weighted and archived. Each decision shapes policy, espionage planning, and the emerging Cold War doctrine. Application for the modern perspective is stark. The disappearance of a single human asset can ripple across decades. Unlike documents or machines, humans possess judgment, improvisation, and discretion. Lose them, and the knowledge they carry is gone, or worse, possibly in the hands of your adversary. The Kapellmeister case becomes a textbook example of this risk. An operative whose existence is repeatedly asserted, yet verifiable proof evaporates in the shadows of bureaucracy. And yet, the story refuses to end. The tension is psychological, strategic, and archival. Every missing ledger, every failed fingerprint, every contradicting witness creates a narrative space where truth and speculation intertwine. Analysts debate, did Kapellmeister vanish willingly? Was he captured? Or did he become an unwilling participant in the post-war intelligence contest between East and West? Every potential answer raises new questions, and every question amplifies the stakes for those who rely on certainty. The close of Part 5 leaves viewers suspended between hope and doubt. A man allegedly alive, a walk-in whose claims cannot be confirmed, and archives filled more with silence than substance. In intelligence, silence is never neutral. It is evidence in itself. A ghost story written in bureaucratic ink. Part 6 will confront the ultimate consequence of this silence. The complete disappearance of Kapellmeister into history, leaving only fragments of records, contradictory cables, and the enduring tension between fact and speculation as the final evidence of a spy who vanished into the turning tide of the Cold War. By the mid-1950s, Kapellmeister had become something of a legend in intelligence circles. Not a hero, not even a confirmed operative, but a ghost. The trail of his existence had dissolved into microfilm scraps, half-shredded case files, and conflicting liaison cables between London and Washington. Analysts would later refer to him as the asset who never fully existed in the West's records. And yet, paradoxically, his disappearance shaped post-war intelligence doctrine in ways far greater than any single operative could have achieved. Every decision about Berlin, every precaution about counterintelligence, every training program on human source management carried the shadow of what the West had lost or failed to secure. The hook of this final chapter is almost painfully human. Beyond the statistics, the codebooks, the safe house maps, there was a man who navigated the collapse of a city, who knew the secrets of Enigma rerouting, who carried knowledge worth empires, and then simply vanished. It is said that one CIA officer, decades later, described reviewing the Kapellmeister dossier as reading the story of someone you are never allowed to meet. This is the essence of wartime intelligence. The most valuable actors leave the fewest traces. The struggle, if it can be called that, was systemic. Across Berlin's bombed sectors, post-war occupation authorities attempted to account for every person, every asset, every file. Safe houses were mapped, then erased. Ration cards circulated, then disappeared. Microfilm reels were lost, misfiled, or intentionally destroyed to protect identities. The very infrastructure meant to record history became a veil that obscured it, and Kapellmeister, like the city around him, dissolved into an operational fog. No one could confirm if he escaped to the western sectors, was absorbed by Soviet intelligence, or perished quietly in the chaos. Every possibility existed, and none could be proven. Insight comes from reflecting on the fragmented cables, the annotations, the post-war memos. One memo from the CIA Directorate of Plans notes, "Silence here is not absence. It is the product of contested custody." That is the closest acknowledgement that Kapellmeister's disappearance was not an accident. It was an intersection of competing intelligence powers, of bureaucracy and human ingenuity, of the end of one war and the beginning of another. Historians looking back see the pattern, where record ends, interpretation begins, and Kapellmeister's story exists in that interpretive space. The reveal is haunting. The files hint at microfilm hidden beneath rubble in Friedrichshain, coded letters sent through Tiergarten, cryptic safehouse notes that vanished before recovery. Contradictory cables suggest he may have been sighted in both Soviet and American sectors at the same time. It is as though the asset exists in multiple realities simultaneously. A phantom whose intelligence value cannot be captured, only inferred. Intelligence officers, both contemporary and modern, often describe this as the operative who proved that absence is actionable. Application in a broader context is sobering. The The Kapellmeister case demonstrates the fragile chain between information and action. Documents survive, machines survive, people, with their judgment, discretion, and mobility, do not always survive, and the consequences of losing them ripple across decades. In many ways, the lessons of Berlin 1945 are still taught in clandestine training programs today. Protect the human source above all, and assume that the adversary is already one step ahead. As the narrative closes, the tension becomes entirely archival. There are no confirmed sightings, no recovered documents, no body, only fragments. A radiogram from May 1945, a British liaison memo, a fingerprint that did not match, a cryptic Soviet ledger entry. Together they form a puzzle with an unresolvable center. The spy who vanished left behind not a story of triumph, but a story of absence. A cautionary tale about the ephemeral nature of human intelligence and the thin line between survival and oblivion. And so, the documentary ends where it began, with silence that speaks louder than any record. The operative's final fate is unknowable. He exists only in the margins, in the gaps, in the tension between recorded history and operational reality. Kapellmeister became not just a missing agent, but the embodiment of the invisible wars fought in shadows. The Cold War already written in the ruins of Berlin before anyone knew the name of the conflict. In that sense, the ghost story is complete. The spy vanished, but the story of his disappearance and what it revealed about the war, intelligence, and the human cost of secrecy endures.